Yeah, David works for Family Voice. And what is your role?
State officer.
State officer, what does that mean?
Well, basically, we have a spokesman in each state,
Yeah.
and I'm the spokesman for South Australia.
Right, okay.
So that means I'm trying to keep abreast of what's going on here politically in South Australia,
Right.
and interfacing with churches because we're keen not simply to raise a voice, but to encourage Christians to raise their voice.
Right. Okay. And the Phillips,
Yes.
are they also spokespeople too?
Yes, they are. Yes, more nationally.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, welcome. Thank you very much for coming on and speaking to us.
Thank you.
And this week our talk is quite radical compared with the others. We're not using PowerPoint.
Oh!
He's actually going to speak.
Holograms.
Mine.
Paint a visual picture.
Okay. So, and we look forward to this very unusual event. And I'll hand it over to you. So thank you very
Lovely.
much.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Well, it's lovely to be with you tonight, and thank you for taking the trouble to come out. Later on in the evening, we'll have a chance to sit around and look at each other more closely and ask questions and make comments, and you're welcome to express a viewpoint different to that which I'm going to be sharing with you tonight. I don't claim to have all knowledge. I'm on a journey like all of us, and I dislike it greatly when people pretend to know the answers. And in some cultures, if you don't know the answer, you'll try and fudge it. You know, in Middle Eastern countries, apparently, you can ask for directions and they say, oh yeah, mister, it's just around the corner, and you know darn well they've got no idea. So I hope that I won't do that tonight if you ask me a question that I don't know the answer to, because it's very important to be honest. And as I was sharing with Nathan this afternoon, I have a good friend who loves to say, I've got absolutely no idea. It's really quite refreshing, especially when he ought to know. But he'll often say, I've got absolutely no idea. And that's a very healthy situation to be in, that we be honest about the things that we struggle to know. And as I was saying to a friend on the phone just yesterday, it's almost impossible to write a true sentence, because someone will come along and say, well, no, you've said that, but what about this? And what about this nuance? And what about this problem? And you realise that it has to be rewritten. It's very difficult to enunciate truth. So with those remarks, let me just begin by briefly introducing my life's work and story to you in a couple of minutes, hopefully. I have spent these last 20 years in what we call civic ministry, which is sharing the wisdom of God for the management of the community and encouraging Christian people as salt and light. So that's what I've been doing for the last 20 years, and I'm starting to get a handle on it just now after 20 years. It's a very complicated matter. So sharing wisdom for the management of the community, that is the wisdom of God for the management of the community, and encouraging God's people as salt and light. So before I did that, I was a teacher for a while in a primary school, and before that, for many years, I was a youth worker. So I've really gone from picking up the pieces of family breakdown and community dysfunction on the one hand to preventing the problem in the first place. So they say it's prudent to build a fence at the top of the cliff rather than to run an ambulance service at the base of the cliff, but really we need both, because some people will still fall over no matter how tall the fence is. So we need the ambulance service at the bottom of the cliff, but I think we also need people who are building fences so that people won't fall over and hurt themselves to the fullest extent possible. So these last 20 years have been a very different journey from the first 10 years or so of my working career. So moving away from residential care, dealing with boys who are homeless, many in trouble with the police, on the one hand, moving towards looking at some of the forces which are damaging marriage and family, and which are damaging children as they are growing up in our culture, and trying to think, well, isn't there a better way we could be doing this? Do we really need to have the highest teen suicide rate in this country, which we like to refer to as the lucky country? You know, should it be Australia that has such a problem of teen suicide? And the list goes on and on about the social problems that are out there. We don't need a lesson or a lecture in that tonight, because our newspapers are full of descriptions about the challenges facing our nation. And though many nations are much worse off, it really is very sad that here in Australia, this blessed nation, this rich and peaceful country, that we still have huge social problems. So that's really what I've been working on these past 20 years or so. And as I say, I'm beginning to get a bit of a handle on the problem, let alone the solution. Well, our topic for tonight is a Christian voice in the marketplace of ideas. It raises the question, firstly, should such a voice be raised? Or put differently, should such a voice be welcomed? Now, I might have a viewpoint, which I do have, that is that as a Christian I must speak. And the prophet, of course, must speak. Not that I'm pretending to be a prophet, but you know what I mean. When you're gripped by an idea, you're convicted of a truth, you've got to speak. And so when Jeremiah came under that conviction, even though he wanted to back away and try to convince God that he wasn't the right man, as did Moses as well. You can read about Jeremiah in the first chapter of his book when he's saying, I'm only a child, I don't know how to speak. He was rebuked by God. So he was impelled to speak. So in a sense, I feel impelled to speak and share the truth in the marketplace of ideas, whether they like it or not. And sometimes they like it and sometimes they don't. And so I've had 250 letters in the Advertiser published in these last couple of decades. So someone does seem to consider my views worthy of publication, if only for the controversy that they might whip up, perhaps. Nevertheless, my voice is able to be expressed. But even if it wasn't received, I would still have to speak it. It's been said that the place for the prophet is on the margin, that the prophet might start in the middle, and Jeremiah started in the middle because he was a priest, but he was soon well and truly in the margin and right down in the well, and then off to Babylon, as we can read in that book. So prophets are pushed to the edge rather quickly, and that's where our ministry is to be found. We'd like to be regarded as mainstream, and we try to be mainstream, but we tend to be pushed somewhat to the margins. But that's where the prophet is to be found, so I don't mind being on the edge, as long as I don't fall off the cliff. So there we are, speaking the truth, in a sense, whether society receives it or not. But it's a good question to ask, especially in a forum where perhaps not everyone here tonight is of Christian persuasion or conviction, whether the Christian voice ought to be tolerated or ought to be heard. So how could we answer that question? It's quite an interesting philosophical one. On what basis should we judge whether any voice, whether it's Christian, Buddhist, atheist, or whatever it might be, on what basis should we decide whether it should be heard? So we could let that question hang in the air for a few minutes. We might want to come back to it in discussion afterwards. Well, I think there are two ways to answer that question. One is to say that Australia has a Christian foundation, and therefore things which are expressed in Christian terms ought conceptually to be received as being coherent with the foundation. So I often make this point in my letters to the editors of newspapers, and it does seem to be quite a compelling argument. And I'll often use the word foundational. It's one of my favourite words, in case you haven't realised by now. I like to slip that word foundation in because I find that it makes my critics at least slow down a bit, because I'm really forcing them to concede that we have a Christian foundation in Australia, even though, of course, we've departed enormously from it and we're falling over ourselves to depart from it even further. Nevertheless, a foundation is precisely that. So this building has a foundation, and it's nice to look around and see how nicely done up the place is, even though it's an old building. And perhaps the foundations have had some reinforcements over the years, I don't know. But the building relies on the foundation, so we can admire the nice brickwork and not think too much about the foundation. But in fact, the brickwork's no good if the foundation is lousy. So the foundation is precisely that, it's foundational. And so I often make the point, well, we have to protect our foundations, because if we cut ourselves off from our foundations, what will we have left? And this, I think, gives pause to my critics. And perhaps for that reason, some of my letters have been advanced further up the ladder, as it were, to see the print of day, if I can use that phrase. So I think foundations are important and are to be protected. And on that basis, I argue that the Christian voice ought to be heard. So that does seem to be quite a winning argument. So we can answer that question, well, how can we judge whether a Christian voice should be heard? We can answer it in relation to foundations. We can also answer it in terms of efficacy, or whether that voice is a useful voice. And we can answer that question about efficacy by comparing nations which have different foundations or different worldviews. So perhaps in discussion later we'll try and pull some nations out of the air. Some of you might have particular experience or knowledge of other nations, and it would be nice to hear what you've got to say about your awareness of them. I haven't travelled much, I must say, but I am a keen student of history and of global politics as well, to some extent. And it's fascinating to look around the world and see what happens in nations which have different worldviews. And so we don't have to run the experiment in Australia to say, well, what would Australia be like if we all decided that we'd be atheists and that we'd ban the cross in the name of Christ, or that we'd ban all religions, including Christianity? Or we might say, well, what would it be like if we were to become an Islamic nation and impose Sharia law? Or, well, maybe we should try Buddhism. Let's become a Buddhist nation for half a century and see what happens. We could run that experiment, but we don't need to run that experiment because it's happening already around the world. So we're in a rather luxurious position, in a sense, of being able to compare worldviews, because we don't have uniformity around the world. Far from it. We've got enormous diversity around the world of worldviews and political systems and ideologies. So we don't have to run the experiment here in Australia to answer the question, should a Christian voice be heard? Because as we consider the answer to that question in relation to efficacy, we simply need to be able to look around. So we have a wonderful opportunity here in this 21st century of knowing almost on a moment-by-moment basis what's going on in other parts of the world. It's incredible when you think of it, really. You can be exchanging text messages to your friend in China or in Africa, and they'll tell you the news before it's on the TV, but the TV will soon catch up. So it's an amazing time to do this comparison. And so I've mentioned atheism, Buddhism and Islam, so perhaps we'll spend a bit of time looking at those three in terms of the comparison. And the classic atheist experiment was, of course, the Soviet Union, where religion was banned, although no one was game enough to go and knock the icons off from the Kremlin, because people's religious sensibilities run rather deep, and though they're instructed and told that you will be atheist, people can be forced externally to hold an atheist viewpoint and still maintain a Christian faith or some other faith quite deeply within their hearts. So states fail constantly to force people to genuinely have a heart change. In fact, it's really not possible. But in the former Soviet Union, we had really misery going on, incredible slaughter under Stalin. At one point, I think it was in the 1930s, he confiscated the grain from the peasants in Ukraine, I think it was, and wanted the grain to be able to sell overseas for foreign exchange so he could buy machinery. And his great 5-year plan to industrialise the Soviet Union came at a great price. So millions starved to death under Stalin's regime. China is another example we could look at as well. But when an American journalist went to go and do some investigation in the former Soviet Union and came back and was asked to summarise his findings, he said simply, central planning creates chaos, which was his assessment of the former Soviet Union. So as we look around, we can see whether good or bad on balance came out of the Soviet Union. And by the way, I should say I'm not trying to wear rose-tinted glasses as I express myself tonight. I recognise there are problems here in Australia, and I've identified the suicide rate as being a particular one. But on the whole, I think on balance, the question can be asked, well, where would we like to retire? I'm not sure if some of the atheist regimes would be the ones we're looking for. I wonder, Nathan, if there might be a glass of water you can get for me. I'm starting to get a bit dry here, possibly the air conditioning, or some milk will be fine if there isn't any cold water. But the the truth is we can ask ourselves the question, well, where would we like to retire? You know, you might want to go to North Korea as a missionary and not expect to come back. And an Adelaide fellow did that recently and was fortunate to come back alive. At the same time, an American missionary to North Korea was sentenced, I think, to 20 years, 20 years of hard labour just for sharing a few Christian tracts. So you might want to go to North Korea as an evangelist and lose your life if you're called to do that, but who would want to go and retire there? So I think the question about where you'd like to go to retire, it sounds almost banal, but it's quite a helpful litmus test, I think, to be able to assess whether there is efficacy in the philosophies or the worldviews that have been adopted by certain nations. So as we look at this question, should a Christian voice be heard in the marketplace of ideas, one of the ways in which we can answer it is to say, well, of what value might such a voice be and how would we know? So I think looking around to see what are the consequences of worldviews and faiths as they've been adopted and applied in a widespread manner in nations is a very helpful way of thinking about that question. So I've mentioned the Soviet Union, I've mentioned China, North Korea. These are places where atheism has been rampant. And North Korea is such a sad place, you know. What good is coming out of North Korea today? You can look at a satellite map at night and the same peninsula is divided by, is it the 39th parallel, and all the lights are on in South Korea where there's peace and prosperity, and there's pitch black darkness north of the border because they haven't got the wherewithal to run the street lights, if they have any. And Alexander Downer tells the story famously of visiting a tall building in North Korea, in the capital, where none of the floors are occupied because the thing is so crooked that the lift can't go up and down. So there are enormous problems in North Korea, and so we've got to ask ourselves, well, why? You know, what's the difference on that peninsula? I guess ethnically they're pretty much the same people up and down that peninsula, and the climate can't be too different north or south of the parallel. But what is the difference? And clearly it's a difference of worldviews and politics. That's how valuable and important politics is. Often as Christians we sort of diminish the value of politics and civic leadership, but when you think of the difference there between the two Koreas, you can perhaps realise that politics is enormously important. In fact, when you think it through, government is really regulating so much of what we do. You know, the electricity grid is managed by government, and there are rules and regulations about building codes. So even to have our meeting here tonight, government is impacting upon what we're doing. So North Korea, China, the former Soviet Union, we could spend a lot of time, and I'm sure you've got anecdotes that you could also tell about the problems facing those communities where atheism has taken hold. So my thesis tonight is that atheism is not helpful for communities. And so on that basis, I think that the atheist view can be expressed, and as in the marketplace of ideas we can sit around and analyse and talk, I think that we should say, well, that is a view that we don't want to become dominant. We're happy to hear from an atheist, and in the marketplace of ideas with our notions of tolerance and freedom of expression here in Australia, which is somewhat under attack but it's largely still there, we can tolerate discussion and welcome discussion, yes, certainly. But at the end of the day, when rules and regulations have to be made and where we decide, how is it that we're going to manage ourselves? I think the atheist claim is not a helpful one to society. So my atheist friends don't like it when I say that, when I debate them on radio or whatsoever. And I ask the question, well, which atheist nation would you like to go to? And they'll forever start making excuses about how it is that there's been a failure of atheism in the atheist countries. And if only they could get the pure atheism. But it's the same old story. You know, the proof of the pudding surely is in the eating. And so they tend not to like it when I ask them what atheist country they'd like to go and retire in. Is it North Korea, China, or the former Soviet Union? You know, it's a bit of a bad lot to decide between those three. Islam is another worldview which presents itself in the marketplace of ideas, and we have to be very sensitive to this whole matter today. It's interesting that people are enormously afraid in Australia of criticising Islam. So we have to be very careful, so we're told. But I'm amazed that with recent atrocities especially, there's been a freeing up of expression here in Australia with regard to Islam. And I suspect that possibly Christian leaders are more timid than secular people in expressing a view about Islam. So it's quite paradoxical, really, because you'd think it'd be the other way around, but not so. But I've noticed in the Australian newspaper just in the last few days, there have been very strong statements against Islam, and I'm really quite amazed that the newspaper would be prepared to go out on a limb in that way. So I think that possibly our culture has been tolerant for a long time and easygoing for a long time, and that the masses in our culture are now starting to get a bit sick and tired of Islam, a little bit sick and tired of Islam, especially with the atrocities that have just been coming through as recently as these last couple of days. You know, kids having their heads sawed off and people being crucified and impaled, and goodness knows what else is going on. And again, those who would apologise or defend Islam will often say, well, no, that's not Islam. That's fanatical Islam or fundamentalist Islam. But again, the question has to be answered, or asked rather, and then answered. What happens to a nation that embraces Islam? And so you can look around the world, and again, we don't have to run the experiment here in Australia. We don't need to adopt Sharia law for 50 years and see whether it's a good idea, because we can look around at other nations. And the truth is that every nation which has adopted Islam has brought sufferings to its people. So it may not be a very politically correct thing to say, and possibly I would temper my remarks if I was speaking to a group of Muslim people here tonight, because you have to build a bridge before you can challenge people. Jesus said, those whom I love I rebuke and discipline, and I think it's important to love people before rebuking them. So if I was invited to speak to an Islamic group, I would approach the matter somewhat more sensitively, but I'm being brutal and frank and honest here tonight because I can get away with it, I suppose. But the truth is that wherever Islam has taken hold, gradually, and then rapidly, as they say, gradually then rapidly, freedoms have been taken away. So Iran, for example, was a moderate Islamic nation in the years before 1980, I think it was, and then Iran became fundamentalist. And Egypt was a moderate Islamic nation until about, 3 or 4 years ago. And now it's become a radicalised nation, not as bad as some other places. But that's the trend. And even places like Britain and France, where Islam is very much in the minority, still there's been a quiet uprising going on and a quiet takeover going on. Because Islam, when it's allowed to flourish, no matter what people might say and how much they might apologise and say it's a religion of peace and say that what's going on in the world is not authentic Islam, well, we have to taste to see. That's the test always, not the theory, but the reality. As I say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So we have to taste to see what it's like, and if it's bitter, then we can only conclude that it's bitter. And if they can't produce something that's not bitter, well, that's not our fault, it's theirs. So I think we have to be willing not simply to live in theory land, it's so easy to do that, but to say, well, now what is the reality? What happens as a matter of reality when Islam, atheism, or whatever the worldview might be, takes over? Well, the other worldview I've touched on briefly in my introductory remarks is Buddhism. Now, Buddhism is quite a benign philosophy or worldview. It's pretty hard to get a Buddhist angry, it seems to me, because their whole philosophy is to do with denial and escaping the material world. And so if you try to take something
from a Buddhist, they might say, well, you're welcome to have it because I'm trying to get rid of it anyway. So it's rather difficult, although I've never tried to take the saffron robes from a Buddhist monk to see, because the truth is that they might hold on to that with a little more alacrity. So it's possible to be materialistic in your anti-materialism, if you know what I mean. But again, the question comes to my mind, and it's a question that I commend to you because it's a question that we tend not to ask. When we're evaluating worldviews, we often think about individual questions such as, well, how does an individual find salvation or certainty, or what's the eternal destiny of an individual within a particular worldview? There's nothing wrong with that. But I like to ask broad brush questions about worldview and about how they relate to the management of nations and communities. I think it's a very helpful one. It's a very helpful approach as we consider this whole question about the relevance of Christianity in the marketplace of ideas. And it's an aspect really of the faith that's not really talked about much at all, because in our churches we tend to consider often the individual, always drill it down to the individual. But I like to think as well about communities, about families, churches and communities, nations, even families of nations. And the scriptures speak about all of that. So I think we need to restore that theology. So when it comes to Buddhism, often the question will be asked of a Christian thinking about the matter, well, you know, what has your worldview got to say to me about my eternity or about sin and these questions, which are all very important questions. But the question about management of the community is one that we tend not to ask. And there, Buddhism is one that fails enormously as well. And the nations where Buddhism is dominant are nations, again, where you wouldn't have an ambition to go there for your retirement, because they are generally places which are impoverished. And Buddhist theology is full of impoverishment, and you can see that right down to the individual monk, indeed, because the individual monk will not want to be involved in mundane things such as growing food or preparing food and cooking food. And cleaning up afterwards. So he'll hold out his bowl and trust that someone else will do that. His idea is to be removed from the material world, because the material world is an illusion, and therefore we need to back away from it, because anything that ties us down to this illusory material world will undermine our spirituality. That's the Buddhist, the central Buddhist theology or philosophy. But they've still got to eat. This is the paradox, you see. They've still got to eat, so they'll hold out the begging bowl and say, please put some food in there. And I presume they give you the bowl afterwards for you to go and do the washing up. I've never really followed through on that one to see. So they're relying on someone else to do it. But this is the double-minded nature of Buddhism, that the Buddhist monks got to eat, and the monk surely sets the scene for the rest of us, because the monk is the priest, and they're more enlightened than the rest of us. So they're teaching us what's right and wrong, and we should follow them, but we can't follow them. In fact, if everyone followed all the monks, we'd all be beggars. We'd all be holding out our bowls to each other, and then we'd all go hungry. So you can see what is a logical consequence of the Buddhist philosophy. And to a certain extent, that has happened to the nations of Buddhist foundation and Buddhist belief. They're not places where iPhones are being manufactured, as it were, or invented, if you know what I mean. They're not places where people have an ambition for that which is material, although we've rather gone overboard in the West and started to worship material things.
Sorry, Dave, I have to say, Japan, Buddhist nation. I mean, it actually rejected Christianity to a large extent.
Yeah, well, are we going to have questions now, or do you want to hold that thought for later?
I just had to say that point.
All right, well, let's make sure that we don't forget that.
Yes.
We'll come back to it.
Park it.
Well, I'll be glad to look at that later. So the Buddhist philosophy is one which has not produced nations of wealth. Japan's been raised as an exception to that, and I'll come back to that. Well, perhaps I should say a word about that now, really. After the Second World War, Japan was highly industrialised because the West, particularly America, invested massively and very heavily in Japan and taught Japan how to do all sorts of things like manufacturing and such like. So I think that's the short answer. The other point about Japan is that it was utterly broken at the end of the Second World War. I mean, utterly broken. I can't imagine a nation that could be more broken than Japan. And
The Second World War, Japan was an industrialised nation.
beforehand,
Yeah, they had plenty of army, navy, and all the rest of it.
yes,
They went into Manchuria, or
yes,
and we wouldn't have been able to take them on by ourselves.
well, as young as I am, I'm old enough to recall what the phrase "made in Japan" meant.
It was a racist.
No, not racist, rubbish.
No, I'm not saying you are, but
No,
I'm saying...
yes, we're getting into the discussion. That's good. I'm young enough to remember what the phrase "made in Japan" meant, and it meant rubbish. And you wouldn't buy something that was made in Japan because you knew it would be rubbish. So now, of course, it's the other way around, because it's been so westernised.
Sorry, Dave. Sorry. The Japanese have taught us quality control, all sorts of things. The Americans sent them over to Japan to learn how they, anyway, the techniques, the Japanese way of making things and making sure they were done right.
In any case, they're more influenced by Shinto, I think.
Is that different?
Yeah,
No,
that's
I mean, I could mention Taiwan or Korea, which are all Buddhist nations.
Yes. Well, I'm happy to dialogue further about that.
Look, I park all that. I just felt Buddhism saying all Buddhist nations are poor is, I'm afraid, probably it can bear some damnation.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I want to.
And with North Korea being dark at night, that could just as well be that they've got a care for the Earth philosophy far above ours, not producing CO2.
I don't think that's the case.
We better let it go.
That's all right. That's all right. Well, I'll finish off a couple of points about Japan, perhaps, and then we'll perhaps come back to that a bit later. But Japan is highly westernised. They love baseball. They have also Christian weddings in Japan, and that occurred because they were absolutely enamoured by Charles and Diana's wedding. When they saw Charles and Diana's wedding on the TV, everyone said, "This is what we've got to have." And so since that time, most of the weddings have been Christian weddings. They're not conducted by Christian ministers. They're conducted by their celebrants, but they are Christian weddings, and they often read 1 Corinthians 13, the great love chapter. So after the war, Japan was enormously broken. In fact, not one shot of anger was fired by the occupying forces when they took over Japan after the war. So right across the nation of Japan, everyone said, right, that's it, no more of this militarism. And so they were broken, and they changed enormously. And they have learned quality control, which they didn't have previously. They did have technology, obviously, although they were isolated from the West for a number of decades or possibly centuries. My history lets me down. But the point I'm making is that the nations which have developed technology and science and the prosperity which is connected with those are largely based on the Christian worldview in those nations. So there are always exceptions to be found, even among our beloved Indigenous people here in Australia. The technology of the boomerang is really quite superb. So even in nations which are non-technological, you can still have some interesting technological breakthroughs. So my thesis tonight is that the question about Christianity in the marketplace of ideas is one which raises a deeper question: how do we know what voices we should be listening to? And I think the short answer to that is to say, well, we don't need to run an experiment. We can look around to see what is valuable in other nations and where have they got that from, and is that something that we want to protect here in Australia because we share it, or is it something that we want to bring in if we haven't got it here already? Do we want to bring in Islam, Buddhism, atheism, just to name three possibilities? Or do we want to preserve as foundational the Christian worldview which came to this nation when the colonial days were starting back in 1788 and onwards, and which have enabled so many sweeping changes to occur here, including the freedoms that we rather take for granted? Now I must just keep an eye on the clock.
You got another 20.
Another 20 minutes, all right. So let's move to a second aspect of this whole question now, which is, should Christians express that worldview? Well, I guess you can predict my answer obviously will be yes. And one of the summaries that I've provided for you to take away and have a look at is called Engaging the Culture and Its Philosophy. And what we find as we look at the example of the Apostle Paul in particular is his engagement with culture. And so in the marketplace at Athens, Paul, distressed by the idolatry, begins to speak to them about matters of philosophy, and they bring him into the Areopagus, as it's called, which was the most prestigious council of elders in the city-state of Athens. And there he spent time speaking with them. And then for 2 years, we read about Paul speaking at a place called the Lecture Hall of Tyrannus. You can read about this in the book of Acts, the 19th chapter. And so for 2 years, Paul holds lectures there in that pagan philosophical hall. It's not clear whether he was speaking to pagans or whether it was his own disciples that were in there. But I think a case can be made that Paul in Athens and in Ephesus was particularly keen to penetrate the marketplace of ideas. And that is so clear for us because of Paul's quoting of pagan authors. In other words, he's not simply coming along with a biblical worldview, but he's wanting to interface in the marketplace of ideas. So he's well versed with pagan poets. And just to summarise for you here, you can see the four pagan authors that Paul quotes, which we find in the Bible. So he quotes Epimenides of Crete, and this is in Paul's letter to Titus, and the phrase there, Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, lazy gluttons. And probably that same author is quoted in the Areopagus, where Paul says concerning the deity, for in him we live and move and have our being. And then in the Areopagus, Paul quotes Aratus of Cilicia, and it could also be Cleanthes who made the same statement, because Paul mentions more than one poet. He says, as some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. And then writing to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul quotes the ancient author Meander, saying, bad company corrupts good character. So Paul is very interested in the marketplace of ideas. So he is really setting us a good example that we today ought to be in the marketplace of ideas. So as we look at this whole question about the involvement of God's people, I think a biblical case can be made that it's good to be in the marketplace and to be speaking not only the truth of God, but as found in Scripture, but the truth of God that's found by other individuals who have stumbled on the truth, we might say, because you don't have to be a godly person to understand all of the things of God. There are some things which can be understood even by pagans, and Paul is quite happy for his mind to be looking carefully at what pagans are thinking and doing, and so he's reflecting back to pagans some of their own philosophy. So I think that's a very important starting place as we consider the role of God's people in the marketplace of ideas. It's always helpful to find common ground, I think, and so Paul, as a scholar, raised in that university town, Tarsus of Cilicia, he was proud to say, I'm a citizen of no ordinary city. And so he was a man of great scholarship, both in Scripture and in secular studies, as we might term that. And so he was able to repeat back to them some of their own views, because he's seeking to penetrate the marketplace of ideas. So in a sense, he's earning the right to speak. And as I quoted earlier, the Lord said, those whom I love, I rebuke and discipline. It's very loving when someone speaks your language, as it were. It's very loving to someone when you are able to quote back to them the things that they hold dear. There's often common ground, and we can often find things in the marketplace of ideas that might not necessarily be Christian, but which we can agree with and echo back to those that we're trying to interact with. And so that's precisely what Paul does. So I think a biblical case can be made that it's good for Christians to be in the marketplace of ideas. But at a more fundamental level is the question about the sovereignty of God over not only the marketplace, but over the whole nation and the whole of the community. And what thrills me as I read the Bible, which I've tried to do a lot in my Christian walk over many decades, is to look particularly for the civic implications of the words that I'm reading. Because often the words of Scripture are read and given that individual application that I've touched on already tonight. But I think that we are doing a disservice to the Scriptures by doing that only, and not seeing the potential for at least applying verses that might even be written in particular to individuals or about individuals, nevertheless to give them a wider application. So I think that it's a very important exercise to do that, because God is interested not simply in the individual, but in community. And so the first great command, as we know, is to love God, and the second is to love our neighbour. So there straight away we have, from the Lord's own teaching, that community is important. Neighbourly relationships are important. And so, well, who is my neighbour? Well, it's everyone. And we live in a great neighbourhood called South Australia, or the whole nation of Australia. And so the love of God for Australia is something that's rather absent in our thinking. So as we look at this whole question of the Christian voice in the marketplace, it's a voice which I think ought to be expressed because God is interested in the whole of the nation. And the marketplace, of course, is a focal point of national thinking. The marketplace in the ancient world, of course, was a place of adjudication and of discussion. I've mentioned Paul at Athens. He was in the marketplace because that's where the philosophers spent their time, not exactly drinking coffee because it hadn't been invented yet, not in that part of the world, but you know what I mean. So they were sitting around discussing the latest ideas, we read. So the marketplace is a centre of community life in the ancient world, and it's probably the case in many parts of the world even today. And when Paul was in trouble, for example, in Philippi, he was dragged into the marketplace because that's where the judges would be found and the case would be pressed and the adjudication would occur. So I do love this word, marketplace, and it's a word worthy of our thinking. In Mark's Gospel, a neglected book of the Bible, because you can read most of Mark in Matthew and Luke, so why bother? But there are a few little gems to be found only in Mark, and one of them is that people were running ahead when they knew Jesus was moving through the region. They were running ahead to go to the next town, and they were bringing the sick into the marketplace. So they knew Jesus' mode of operation. He was a marketplace minister, if I can use that phrase, and they could kind of predict where he was going from one town to the next, and they knew where in the town he would be, the marketplace. That's where the action happens. And so they would run ahead with the sick, place them in the marketplace, because they knew Jesus was going there. So our Lord has really set a wonderful example about the importance of God's people being in the marketplace. For him it was for healing and preaching, but there's a principle there that's where the action happens. And so marketplaces are very important places for the people of God to be ministering and for the voice to be expressed there. So I think that the supremacy of Christ, if I begin to draw my remarks to a conclusion, I think a recognition of the supremacy of Christ will help those of us who follow him to realise that we do have a voice to raise in the marketplace, because Christ is interested in the marketplace. And in Colossians there's that wonderful exaltation of him, where we read that thrones, powers, rulers and authorities on earth, as well as in heaven, visible and invisible, have been made by him and for him and are sustained by him, and he seeks supremacy over them. So I really commend to you, as I draw my remarks to a conclusion, that wonderful exaltation of who Christ is, so that those of us who follow him will recognise that he has a great interest in thrones and in powers and in rulers and authorities. I'm not sure that our churches explore much the interest of God in earthly thrones. In fact, it's the reverse. If you try to say anything about an earthly throne, immediately churches start falling over themselves by saying, oh, well, you know, my kingdom is not of this world, and we're to be in the world and not of it, and there's truth in all of that, of course, but Nevertheless, Christ has created every earthly throne, and he sustains every earthly throne, power, rule and authority, and those things have been made for him, and he seeks supremacy over them. So that passage alone, if that's all we had to work with, but there are other passages, Romans 13, which speak about God's sovereignty over government and his interest in the work of government. Paul is really commending it. Peter does the same in 1 Peter 2 when he speaks about our role to submit to government, where he says, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men. You know, if I can introduce that tone of voice, which is often absent as we read Scripture, of course, because they're black and white words, but I really feel that Peter is rejoicing in that notion. He's not grudgingly saying, submit, gnash your teeth and put up with it. I really sense, given all of what the Scriptures say about governance, at least ideally in submission to Christ. Revelation gives us another picture when there's a failure of recognition of who he is, of course. But I really sense that Peter is rejoicing. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men. Well, what's the implication for that with regard to the raising of the Christian voice in the marketplace of ideas? It's as though we ought to be falling over ourselves to run to the marketplace, just as those were running to anticipate that Jesus would be there, because that's one of the places where he wants to be, in the marketplace. So I really hope that as we think further about these matters, that all of us who are Christians will recognise God's great interest in the marketplace and in the marketplace of ideas, and that he wants a voice to be shared there. And we haven't got time to look at an example, a New Testament and no less an example in the Apostle Paul providing leadership in the crisis in the community that he's facing. It's in those last 2 chapters of the book of Acts, so perhaps take that away as a homework exercise. But in the last 2 chapters we see Paul in action, and he's not simply philosophising, he's really rolling up his sleeves. He's sharing food on the ship and urging people who are hungry to eat because they're facing death, they've all lost their appetite. He's saying to them, come on, you need to eat because the boat's going to crash, but you'll all be okay, but you need it to survive. And then when they do crash onto the island of Malta, once again, Paul's rolling up his sleeves to get the fire going and get the firewood collected and all of that. So what we're really seeing here is not Paul sort of just philosophising or theologising remotely, but that he's right in the centre. And just to go back onto the ship for a moment, when Paul sees that some of the sailors are wanting to slip away, that they're lowering the lifeboat on the pretense of setting anchors, we read. Paul senses that they are really absconding, and so he says to those listening, unless those men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. So the soldiers whip out their swords and they cut the ropes to release the lifeboat. Well, who's giving the orders? So Paul, lacking any position, any formal position of leadership in the community, is nevertheless front and centre at the marketplace of ideas. And it's not just ideas. This is now managing the crisis facing the community as the ship is about to be destroyed as it crashes onto the reef, onto the outskirts of Malta. There is Paul front and centre, effectively taking charge of the ship. So he's not dominating because he's got power over people, but he's sharing the wisdom of God. He's being believed. There's an authenticity in his proclamation. And so without having any rank or position in the Roman army, the soldiers are heeding his instructions. So I think that when we look carefully at what the Scriptures say, there is a very strong case to be made that we ought to be penetrating the marketplace of ideas, because without the wisdom of God, we could go like so many other nations, with the possible exception of Japan, which we might come back to in later discussion. But the point I'm making is that the Christian worldview is self-authenticating, and the proclamation of God's people is self-authenticating. And as we see it in action, we can benefit from it, and therefore make a strong case that it is good and wise for us. So I think that's a good time to draw our remarks to a conclusion, Kevin. I'm certainly getting dry and need another glass of water, but we're going to break now Is that right? And
Okay.
have a
Anyway, thanks very much.
thank
for your
you.
talk.
Thank you.
I'll just open up with a question. You've said that we should be involved in the marketplace of ideas. A question that rises to me is, in what manner? How should we? From the point of view that should we seek to impose Christian values on the rest of society, or should we just consider ourselves as one group amongst many to express their opinion?
Yeah.
Like, what should be our goal in terms of how we go about it?
Yes. Well, I think it would be a very un-Christian thing to try to force the Christian faith on anyone. So the story of South America is not very good there, where the faith was imposed, especially on leaders. There was one famous example where the leader was told, you can become a Christian, we're going to kill you anyway, but if you become a Christian, we will strangle you and we won't burn you. So you can be strangled and burned, or strangled and not burned. So which would you like? So he chose Christian baptism, so he wouldn't be burned, but they burned him anyway. You know, so there are some unfortunate examples of Christians getting a bit too zealous and not behaving in a Christian manner. So it is clear from the Lord's teaching that we're to love our enemies and we're to do good to those who persecute us, and I think you can reasonably extrapolate from that you shouldn't strangle people so that after they've been baptised their bodies won't be burnt. So I think that we ought to commend the Christian worldview, and I've been hopefully describing how when we look to see what will happen when the Christian principles are applied, that they are good for communities and that they're not bad for communities. And so really what we're trying to do in our ministry at Family Voice Australia is to provide evidence for certain courses of action which happen to be Christian, but we're not relying upon their Christian basis as the lever, if you like. That the lever is the efficacy and the demonstrable value of those principles and practices.
So you're saying we should be arguing on the basis of reason,
Yeah.
why certain actions are good,
well, not so much,
rather than
yes.
saying the Bible says so.
Yes,
and therefore
I think so. It's not so much reason as evidence or demonstrable value. And so because the world is so diverse, you can often find examples of where people have tried things which we are now thinking about trying, for example, here in Australia. So instead of running the experiment, we can look around either across the world or sometimes back in history to see, well, we tried that and look what happened, or they've tried it over there and look what happened. So the trouble is we're often opposed by people who are not interested in the evidence. It's paradoxical. You know, we're often accused of being the ones that are running the religious line. But if you read our magazines, which are designed for a secular audience as well as a Christian one, yes, we say we're a Christian voice. We don't hide from that. We're not relying on that when we make the case. So this particular one might not be a particularly good example, but it's often the case that you can read our magazine from cover to cover and you won't even find a biblical quotation or a Christian reference. Sometimes you will, sometimes you won't. We're happy to slip one in from time to time, even though we know that the members of Parliament who read it are not necessarily Christians. And we send this to every member of Parliament in the nation. And of course, subscribers to our publications are mainly Christians, and they are happy to see the evidence that we're supplying, as well as the occasional Christian reference, but they can find their own, if you know what I mean. So what we are commending is evidence, but it's surprising that we will often find ourselves being accused of being religious, and we'll say, excuse me, when did we mention the Bible in that submission that you're waving around and critiquing? When did we mention the claims of Christ? You're mentioning it, we're not. And so people are very prejudiced sometimes as they read our publications, and they're looking for a religious claim which might not be there, even though it could well have informed our position, but we're not relying on that because we don't need to, because God is good and therefore his ways are good. And if something is good, it can be demonstrably seen to be good, and you can speak about that evidence without relying upon naming Christ as the author of every good thing, but having explained that these good things do have a source, we can then glorify him, and hopefully people who are suspicious of Christianity will see its efficacy and therefore be interested to know what is the author of the efficacy. It's a long answer to the short question, Kevin.
Yeah. Okay.
Dave, exactly how can we do this? Because to be honest, the church has a big public relations problem. Emotionally, somebody brought up in the church, yes, want to speak about what we know, what we've come to learn through not only the book that they accuse us of following, but it comes through revelation. But also intellectually, we have to. Do we need to find a new way to express this this message? The minute you bring up anything relating to anything that sounds like any view that opposes the atheistic worldview at the moment, no, you're a Christian, no. They all put us into the same boat. Faith is the enemy today. Look at those Muslims. Look at what's happening in the world. They put us all in the same boat. How can we? Should we change the way we do?
The beginning point is to have an ambition for the marketplace, and I've touched on that tonight. But there's a lot more to be said about what the scriptures say. But the truth is that our churches don't have an ambition for the marketplace. They don't have an ambition for Tony Abbott, or for Joe Wetherill, or for their local member of parliament, or their senator, or whomsoever. And so Paul says that it's an urgent priority. He says, I urge them first of all. So it's a double imperative in 1 Timothy, that God's people pray for the authorities. Why? That we may live peaceful and quiet lives. So Paul is really impressing the importance of God's people participating in producing a community in which we can, all of us, Christian and non-Christian, can live peaceful and quiet lives. And so Paul urged that as a priority because he needed to urge it, and maybe they weren't getting it then, they're certainly not getting it now. So we really excel in our ministry in urging that as a priority. Prayer for the authorities that we may live peaceful and quiet lives. So the point about prayer is that it is not us hoping that God will fix the problem, but that we are dedicating ourselves to him in service of solving the problem, which means that if we pray, thy kingdom come, that we will be useful to make the kingdom come, and that we will therefore turn up. They say the world is run by those who turn up. So our whole community is being run by a few people, because mainly not Christians, because Christians don't have an ambition for the work of the authorities. So that's where it must begin. And if we get that right, the rest will take care of itself. People will find ways of penetrating the parliament and the political process if they're sufficiently bringing those matters to God in prayer.
So would you, would you be in favour of a merging of church and state? We have a separation of church and state in Australia.
Well, kind of, yeah. There's not a strict separation. The closest is that there's no religious test for people who hold office in the Commonwealth, which is section 116 of the Constitution. The preamble speaks about the people humbly relying on the blessing of Almighty God. The US has got a stronger separation than we do, but that was in fact...
And yet they've got in God we trust written on.
They've got that written on the money. Well, the reason there's a misunderstanding, and the misunderstanding relates to the separation, and the separation is not to keep the church out of government, but to keep government out of the church. So if you look over the history there, it's quite fascinating, because government will forever extend its tentacles, and churches don't appreciate it when government. The chaplaincy program is probably a case in point, where the chaplains are walking a very careful line about what they say and do, because afraid of the government jerking the purse string. So we've inverted the truth about the separation of church and state, It's not to keep church out of government, it's to keep government out of the church.
However,
Having said that, I'll just finish the sentence. Having said that, we don't, as Kevin was sort of suggesting, I think, we don't want to be dominating simply because we're Christians and we know best. We want to be persuading people on the basis of the wisdom that we're sharing and its efficacy. Although still someone's worldview always dominates, because that's the nature of community. And
but a lot of people disagree with you on that separation of church and state, or your interpretation of it, because our freedoms have not come from the fact that one religion has dominated us, the Church of England, the Catholics, or whoever, and asked us to be burned at the stake if we disagree with them, but because we fought for our freedoms and we have what's called democracy. And that is a fundamental difference, and there is a separation of church and state, and that's why I think most people believe, including many Christians, why we enjoy the freedoms we do. Because there are so many versions of Christianity that which one would you recommend that we take on board?
Yes, indeed. Well, I'm not advocating that we will dominate because we're Christians.
No, I'm not saying that either. I think a Christian is... Having said that, I agree that every person should be allowed to express their views, and that includes Christians, and includes Christians on who I would disagree with on the extremes sides of it. But like the Canadian said, who I can't remember his name, that I agree to, I'll defend to the death your right to say it. So that's important that we were talking about.
Yes, was it Voltaire?
Yeah, no, not Voltaire. It was actually a Canadian Prime Minister.
Was it?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I think Voltaire said it before the Canadian.
No, I think maybe the Canadian Prime Minister was quoting him, but
probably.
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Where I've heard it from was the Canadian Prime Minister.
Yeah, go on.
The next constitution is going to be very eye-opening for Australia, though.
The next constitution.
Which one's this one?
That's a long way away.
No, it's not that far away necessarily. When Australia decides it wants to separate itself from England.
I don't think that there's going to be any constitutional change in Australia for the forthcoming foreseeable future in relation to, if you're talking about the monarchy,
correct.
I can't see any change in my lifetime coming. But that's an interesting question. The Constitution in the preamble mentions the bishops of the House of Lords. Because the authority behind the Constitution was the British Parliament, because there wasn't an Australian Parliament as an authority. So the preamble which I've quoted, which we sort of receive as an Australian constitutional preamble, technically it's not in the Constitution, it's outside of it, it's in the British Act. But there you've got a much closer connection between church and state, because head of state, which is the Queen Elizabeth, is also head of the Anglican Church, and there are the senior bishops of the Anglican Church sit in the House of Lords. This is all starting to be changed now, but we do piggyback on that, so much so that the Lords Spiritual, as they're referred to, the senior bishops of the Anglican Church, the Lords Spiritual are mentioned in the Australian Constitution preamble.
But there's so much of an undercurrent of anti-Christian feeling and sentiment. It's like the kettle is boiling, and the pressure is mounting on the lid. When somebody makes a decision, I think there's going to be lots of changes.
Oh, absolutely.
Lots of changes when we do become. When we do become a republic.
If we're going to, yes.
Yep. They'll be lining up. Yeah, there's be a great list of changes we make.
What we're seeing with the chaplain program, what we're seeing with now Julia Gillard taking her support away from Israel. Obama taking his support away from Israel. There's lots of changes. With our culture.
That's just recalcitrance.
I don't think that has anything to do with republicanism.
Yeah.
No.
Well, the connection is that
the new atheism.
Well, the connection is that the monarchical system in our tradition is a Christian concept, because the Queen, whoever is sovereign, must make Christian promises. So Charles, when he becomes king, the Queen were to drop dead tonight, heaven forbid, he becomes king tomorrow, be crowned a year later or so, he must make Christian promises. And so
Does it matter whether he cares?
Well,
does it matter if he's just signer?
he's an adulterer. He's
Well,
going to be the next 10
well,
years.
he has to make
Well,
them.
first,
Well, so is David.
He has to make them, and that's how it's been arranged. And we can argue the merits of that, but I think there are consequences. And so this don't know why I brought this along, but it's proved awfully useful for this point. But this is called Administering Nations in the Public Good, which speaks about in part, the role of civic authorities in their submission to the Crown, because all of our civic authorities must promise to serve the Queen. It's one of those forgotten aspects of our culture that's regarded as an anachronism.
Do you reckon it actually means anything to
Well,
anyone at any level?
Well,
That stuff?
it means a lot to me.
Does
It
The
does.
Crown?
Absolutely.
No, or are you saying
My
the
allegiance to the Queen as a justice of the peace. And all of our civic authorities have had to promise to serve the Queen, so you'll have to ask them what they think about it. But in a sense, what they
But
think
in what sense do you serve the Queen?
She's Queen of Australia, in that sense.
Yeah.
Well, I
most
want
people
to
would take that promise and have their fingers crossed, wouldn't they?
I don't. Well, this is the interesting question. But this all relates to what worldview do we take to ourselves. Historically, we have taken to ourselves a very strong Christian ethos for public service.
Yes.
And that I think is probably one of the most important things which is not discussed in that whole republic monarchy debate, because it wasn't that long ago that people certainly took such matters very seriously. And it's very hard to know what people think about
But
the
isn't
Queen.
it, I mean, it says to work at everything with all your heart,
Yeah.
as if to God,
That's
not
right.
as if to the Queen of England.
I'm sorry, what about 1 Timothy that David's already quoted? Paul himself said, honour the emperor.
Well, that's in, yes,
Yeah.
that's in,
Now, admittedly, he was in the Roman Empire, but he was in another part of the Roman Empire.
that's Peter, it's 1 Peter 2.
Oh, Peter. Sorry,
Yeah.
apologies. Yes, it was Peter. So,
But yeah, so you read that at your leisure and you'll get some further insights. But what people think about their allegiance to the Queen, and every police officer, every military person, every judge, every member of Parliament has had to make a promise. It's an oath if they want to use the scriptures or even the Quran, but and it's an affirmation if they don't. But the Queen is irrepressible in that sense, and despite all the Republican push in 1999, when people in the privacy of the voting compartment had the secret ballot, they overwhelmingly gave the Queen a great big tick. So it's very hard to know, but I certainly take very seriously my 2 promises as a Justice of the Peace to serve the Queen.
But
I guess.
in what way
Well,
are you serving
in
the
what way?
Queen?
Well, I have promised.
You're serving
my
Australia
allegiance.
and God, maybe, but
Well, I didn't have to become a Justice of the Peace,
Yeah.
but if I want to be a Justice of the Peace, which I did, then the deal was, well, you've got to make your allegiance to the Queen. So you can take it or leave it. And one member of Parliament was famously locked up in Big Ben about 100 years ago because he wouldn't promise to serve the Queen. So you can't, and Gerry Adams could not take his seat in the House of Commons because he refused. So the reverse question is, what does it mean to refuse, which is another.
Well, I
matter
think
for
Perry's
discussion.
question is, what does it mean to serve the Queen?
Yeah.
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 Well,
Like, I mean, some people talk about serving God and
Yes.
they mean no more,
Yes.
but we take issue with that, right?
Well, we can, but
What difference does it make in terms of what you do to serve the Queen?
well, this is the whole question about the value, about what is the value of monarchy. But I'm not sure if we want to have that discussion tonight, or do we?
No.
I guess,
Definitely not.
We can
just
get on to
coming
number.
back to where we were going before, I guess my frustration, a lot of what you said tonight, really great, no problem. But it seems that a lot of the time we make this false distinction between what I'll call moral issues and ethical issues. And so what I mean by moral issues are issues of like abortion or gay marriage or those kind of things. And we make that realm over there, and then we have what we'll call ethical issues. And those ethical issues would be things like the treatment of the poor, the underprivileged, those kind of things.
Okay.
And I find that a lot of the time, some of the vocal Christian groups seem to focus more on what I'll call moral issues. So, for example, Family First would be one example of that, and Family Voice would be that. I was looking at your website before, and I looked at what your core, things that you're arguing about are, and they're gay marriage, their abortion, their euthanasia, those kind of things. And yet, and it's really interesting, you mentioned Jeremiah and Moses. The thing is, with Moses and Jeremiah, actually the thing that God's really ticked off at the Egyptians for, and really ticked off with the Israelites for, are actually what we would call ethical issues. The way they show justice to the poor, the way they treat those that are underprivileged, the way that they treat slaves and stuff like that. Like refugees and things like that. And so I think this comes back to your point. Why do people have such a disparaging thing with us? Well, because if you actually talk to a lot of 20-somethings and stuff like that, they really, really are ticked off at the way that we treat refugees, and they're really ticked off at the way that we're, treating the poor and the underprivileged, and all of these kind of things, which we'll put in that ethical banner. And yet, when they actually say, well, what's the Christian Family Voice or whatever actually saying about our silence?
Yes.
And so that's actually where you would gain credibility for then actually being able to talk about the rest of the stuff.
Other sectors of the church are strong on that.
Yes, they are, and they're the ones that...
Jamie Briggs' office.
And that is...
What, Eric?
Love Makes the Way, so Kate and those guys.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly. And you know who will sit down and actually listen to them when they actually switch the conversation to talking about abortion? Atheists and secularists and 20-year-olds and those kind of people. Because they say, if you're willing to sit down with me and actually work about how we're treating refugees and stuff, that gives me a hell of a lot more time for actually listening to you about the rest of this stuff.
Sorry, Matt, are we talking about queue jumpers or the people in Syria and Iraq who probably could never afford to pay a trip to Australia?
Either.
And see, immediately that's where we're going.
Yeah.
No, my frustration is that we're immediately going to that kind of an attitude instead of actually recognising that there's a massive sense of compassion and a heart for justice and all those kind of things within, our community, and we're not actually engaging with that. We're too busy talking about these other issues.
Sorry, my brother and sister-in-law work in Cairo. There are Sudanese who've been in refugee camps in Sudan who haven't got a schmeck of a chance of paying a people smuggler to get here to Australia. They're the people that are being left behind, not the folks that are...
Just respond to... I appreciate what you're saying enormously. I think, as I said earlier, we earn the right to speak by rolling up our sleeves, and I think that all Christians ought to be... Well, the wider Christian community at large ought to be making sure that it's caring for the poor and the orphan and all of what you say. I don't disagree for a moment. I think I mentioned earlier that I was a youth worker for 9 years with homeless boys, so still getting over that. That was a very painful part of my time.
Probably the boys are too.
They probably was getting over, but
being homeless boys.
It's often the case that people who are in the forefront.
Can I just clarify?
Hang on, no, you don't need to. I think this is the crux point. So
it's often the case that it's hard to get a full picture of what a person's ministry is all about, and I didn't make much. Well, when I first started off with Family Voice, I was still doing visiting in the Cabin Training Centre, which is the youth secure care facility. But I made nothing of that because, in a sense, that was no one else's business, and I wanted to respect the privacy of the boys that I was visiting in the youth jail, so that wouldn't be on the website or it wouldn't be in our publication. So I appreciate this opportunity to be able to try to help people to understand that the last thing we want to be is closet moralisers. And I remember I was speaking to an MP about this once, and he said, "Oh, you people, you just want to lock people up and throw them in jail." And I said, "Well, some of the boys that I visit," I did mention it at this point, I said, "Some of the boys that I visit in secure care, they'd be dead if they weren't locked up because of drug taking." So, in fact, what might appear like a heartless and cruel response, which is to lock them up, in fact, it can be life-saving. I mean, there might be another way around it, a more creative way, but When push comes to shove, sometimes people who are in desperate situations, they really need a strong intervention. And so the point I'm making, I appreciate what you're saying. And we don't do very well as God's people when we make a pronouncement to make it clear that we're also getting our hands dirty or rolling up our sleeves, if I can use that expression.
But equally, if on Family Voice, if on your website you put on something about ecology, if you put something on about key issues that emerged out of the latest budget in terms of how poor are being treated, if you put up there things about, you know, a treasurer saying that poor people don't drive, those kind of things, I mean, that starts to talk into these issues. And like the silence there is quite deafening, like literally deafening, because people don't listen when you don't actually talk about those issues.
In their defence, should every Christian organisation be all things to all men, or is it reasonable for some groups to focus on different things where they have areas of expertise?
That's true, except that this is a group that is advocating and as a government, to talk into government and government doing what government does. And government does all kinds of things, including talking about this kind of stuff.
There are other groups that are also Christian that are advocating.
Yeah, there's the
I think there's an absence of Christian ecological reflection and proclamation. I absolutely agree with you that it would be helpful to have that. We do find it impossible to keep up with the limited brief we've set ourselves. But it would be good if there were, and there are a few, I think perhaps in America, but I'm not sure if in Australia, you might know, whether there are Christian groups which are enunciating a theology of good ecological management.
I think
right up there, that's NEEN.
Okay.
And NEEN stands for the National Energy Efficient Network. And that's being run by Catholic Care.
Right.
Right, so that's an example straight away.
I do believe that Christians ought to be the most ecologically aware and sensitive and wise and declaratory, if I can use that phrase, people in the world, because we have been given the mission to steward creation.
when it comes to compassion for the poor and stuff, I think that is one thing that even people who are not Christians within our culture recognise is perhaps sliding as a value.
But should it be government funded? I have an old guy at our church who's about 80 years old who remembers that in his family, his mum and dad put two uncles who had lost their ability to look into their own home.
I'm not saying that there should be money. I mean, you're not looking for money for any of the other issues that you're advocating for. It's not about funding and stuff. But I think in terms of saying, as a community, do we want to go in this direction? That's what Family Voice is about. You're saying, as a community, we want to go in the direction of abortion, for example, right? And you're saying, well, no, we don't, right? And equally, you could say, as a community, do we want to lose our compassion for people doing it tough? Well, no, we don't. In that sense, it's no different. But I think that it's possibly an issue it's an issue that I hear when I'm talking with non-Christian friends. They will agree that those values are on the slide in our community.
This is true.
And partly they recognise, partly they, and I would agree, think, well, because we are richer in general, right?
We're $600 billion in debt.
As individuals.
As individuals, we're extremely well.
So it's not necessarily about, should everybody get soy sauce to put with their rice? It's about compassion. It's about the way those who don't cope so well with our complicated society are viewed with compassion or contempt. And that's it's just another thing that's on the slide, but it's like so many other things, right? I guess I'm only saying it because ties into what you were saying.
Sorry, Matt, am I hearing it right? Do the current 20-somethings believe the government should be the solution to all the problems?
No, they're not. They're not left wing, but they do recognise that if a government is doing things that seem like where they see things that seem uncompassionate,
Like,
where do I even begin? Like when they see all kinds of things that are seem to be uncompassionate, there are a whole host of those, and just spend time talking to them and listening to them about those.
they realise the mining tax probably gained a tenth of what it was supposed to get, and great promises were made from it, and that is driving us further into debt. Do they recognise the fiscal problems we have in our country?
I think what Steve's saying is you can appear and take the obvious action to be compassionate, spend money, but it's not that easy.
It's not, but it's not necessarily about spending money. It's about community attitude. It's about the heart and the uncle who gets looked after and whatever else. Yeah. Right? It's the same when you're talking about abortion or gay marriage. You're not talking about funding some new program. Yeah. You're talking about what we care about.
Someone off the streets and look after them.
Yeah, they do.
They do. Well, that's good.
Right. And I mean, I guess the other thing with this is that when we actually think of this holistically, in the sense that God is the Lord of all of these issues, ethical and moral, you start to actually see that this moral issues and ethical issues intersect. And so a classic example is that a large proportion, evidence out of the US is pretty abundant on this, a large proportion of the people who have abortions are from a lower socioeconomic group for a whole host of reasons. So one way to actually help save lives in terms of pro-life stuff is to actually create better socioeconomic situations. And so, like, you know, I mean, that's not the only reason. There's a whole host of other factors involved. I recognise that. But my point is that these things aren't mutually exclusive. They actually intersect. So if you want to actually help save, you know, babies from abortion and pro-life all the way, very emphatically, you actually do that through ethical things as well, like, you know, helping the poor and those kind of things. Creating better education,
single mums,
you know, making it so that the woman,
and not just giving them money, actually giving them a little bit of respect.
Exactly, making it so that the young 16-year-old girl who feels that she has no choice but to have an abortion is finds herself within a society where it is safe for her to actually have a child, and that comes out of a whole host of ethical, systemic things getting fixed.
Right.
This should be the church's job.
Did you remember what happened up in Salisbury about a year ago? I had this conversation with Family Voice against it. Right at the moment, the idea of paying people to have children, very good, pretty Costello, seemed a good idea at the time.
Paying people to have children?
Yeah. You know, the
baby bonuses.
Okay.
You go up there and you have that horrible example up in Salisbury where a mother and a partner were breeding kids and not caring for them. They were just left in the most squalid, horrible, rape-infested conditions. And there was a recent one, I think Gillies Plains, similar thing. I could name another place next to Nord, I'm not going to say it, where you give money for something and it distorts people's values.
But that's not what I'm saying. No, what I'm saying is that we're...
16-year-old man, if you give it, then her friend was like, oh, that girl, and you heard, I don't know if you remember, it used to be called, in America, probably 20 or 30 years ago when they started to support single mothers, girls would go out and get pregnant. Independence Day, because they could move out of their family, suddenly getting paid. Money corrupts people, and it does. Money does.
There are certainly unintended consequences right throughout government. It's, Nick said that the one thing he learned after many years in Parliament was that there are unintended consequences to decisions, and both sides of politics make this mistake.
Yeah.
The Liberal government recently announced this idea about people applying for 40 jobs when they're unemployed. Well, I mean, that is just ludicrous.
Soul destroying.
And soul destroying. And they, you know, it was a knee-jerk reaction. They were down in the polls. They wanted to.
And it really looks like they're just trying to take
to the poor.
Well, or just reduce the unemployment rate by people not being able to jump through enough hoops as proper unemployed people.
And so the benefit of our community is that we can analyse and critique government wonderfully. And the Liberal government's been backpedaling quite rapidly on a few things lately, and it's because of the power of community. So I think that it's a wonderful opportunity we have in Australia to shape the civic culture by speaking words of wisdom and having rolled up our sleeves as well.
Can I just get back to the subject of the night briefly?
Go on.
in the whole idea of Christians expressing Christian views in the marketplace, what is commonly and regularly and loudly spoken out is that it's quite fine for you to believe whatever you like, but don't try and push your morality on me or on the country or on everybody else. Keep it to yourself. It's a private thing.
It's not possible to do community with that principle, because everyone would just have to go and live in little caves or something. If we're going to live in the same area, if we're going to have cities and towns and communities, we have to have laws and we have to have values. And someone's values dominate. Dominate's not the ideal world, or predominate, if I can use that word, soften it slightly. But we will settle on principles and laws, and we say that's going to be the way it is. So you won't be able to drive the car if you're under 16. So we draw the line. You know, we're constantly drawing the line and saying this is legal and this is illegal, this is right to be approved and that's wrong to be punished. So we can't escape that process. And anyone that tells me that you're a Christian, so be quiet, I would say, well, I have as much right as anyone else to put my views forward, and I commend them to you on their merits. I am a Christian. I'm informed by the Christian worldview, but I'm not asking you to believe on that basis. I mention it because I want to give glory to God. That's my faith, and I hope you'll respect my faith, just as I will respect your faith. If you want to say something to me and say that it's coming out of your Islamic theology, then I respect you as an individual and I love you as an individual. I might not agree with your view, but I will hear you, and if you can persuade me on merits that the course of action you're suggesting is better than mine, and we do have things to learn from Islam, such as the invention of the zero. So I possibly should have tempered some of my remarks tonight by speaking of some of the virtues that have been discovered in non-Christian contexts, because we don't have a monopoly on the truth, because God has revealed the truth in creation, and anyone that lives in creation is capable of discovering the principles of creation, and the zero, which is really God's invention, because there was a beginning point in the cosmos. The zero is something that the Arabs seem to latch on to and commended it to the rest of the world. In fact, we use Arabic numbers. So in fairness, and I hope I've not been disparaging to Islamic people, Buddhists or atheists tonight, but while we can embrace the individual and recognise that there are aspects, nevertheless, the broad brush principles which are espoused by those non-Christian systems, I don't think are going to be beneficial for Australia.
Can I come back to the first point you made, talking about atheism? Talking to my friends, hey, this is a new atheism. No, it's all the same. It is a faith structure. You're talking about the roots of it. That's right. Going back to the Ukraine and the ancient atheism. You only have to go to YouTube to find this new brand of atheism. How do we as Christians talk about the philosophy behind this new atheism, humanism? You go to YouTube, Stephen Fry will give you a nice whiteboard demonstration of the new atheism. You know, this is it. It's all about humanism. It's all about looking after each other, one another. You don't need God for this. You know, it's very, you know, it's these are the new things we're up against. Christians, how do we come in as Christians to combat this?
I think that Christians are not sufficiently ambitious to interface with the hurting world, and I think that atheists and people of non-Christian faith are suffering enormously, because Islam, for example, provides no certainty of salvation. So that can't be good for the heart. And atheists, as far as I can tell, don't really want to be atheists. I mean, the atheists that I come across and hear about in the community, people like Philip Adams, you know, they don't really want to be atheists. Philip Adams famously said, "I'm not a Christian, but if I was, I would give God everything." That's a statement of heartache.
Wow.
And of deep longing. Now, for whatever reason, he can't believe. You know, I think his father left when he was 3 or something. You know, he's got huge personal baggage, yeah. And so I think that that we don't need to fight atheism intellectually so much as win atheists with the love of God. There has to be an intellectual component to it, but it's often the case, all of us, that we sort of make up our minds what we want to believe and then find the intellectual arguments to support it later. That doesn't sound very theological, but it's in fact the way God has made the world. Our children follow in our footsteps. The children participate in the Passover without understanding. That's why they ask the question, why the unleavened bread? But the point is that they're at the table. So if we can sit at the table with atheists, Muslims, Buddhists, and everyone else, we will in fact empower them to ask us, why is it that you love me, and how is it that you are loving, and how is it that you've got an ambition to transform the world in a way that's benefiting me, even though we have a different worldview. So I think it's at that level that we've got to penetrate the marketplace, not so much in sort of dominating with placards and banners and clever arguments, but winning people's hearts. And even at an intellectual level, and this is something that our ministry might move towards as time goes on, especially equipping others to do it rather than us doing it, is to love the members of Parliament. And as I said earlier, I'm not sure how many churches have got that as an ambition. If we're to pray for the civic authorities and we're to seek peace and prosperity, and it's in Jeremiah 29:7 as well, seek the shalom of the city, which is pagan Babylon, where God's people were. If we really have that ambition, we will be sitting down with cups of coffee with our local member of Parliament, with whom we might disagree philosophically enormously, but that we're wanting to love them into the kingdom.
They mightn't have time.
I think they will.
Yeah.
The local
turned up
MP,
in your street for a meeting not long ago.
Members of Parliament are very keen to interface with the community because they know if they upset more than a handful, they're gone. So it's only the MPs in safe seats that are unwilling to meet. But generally they're unwilling to meet because they're afraid. I'm convinced of this.
I'm just saying that us as a Christian movement need to communicate the idea of that atheism is not good. We have to come up with a new way. I'm saying this because the old atheism is different to this new brand of atheism. We have to readjust our communication.
I think sort of one of the other things you've talked about, there's a lot of the bad feeling towards Christians is because we're kind of connected with the establishment in the past.
And the Westboro Baptist Church.
Well, I think because because the church was kind of part of the establishment in the old days, and Australians probably a lot of people kind of want to be against the establishment, and so for that reason, I think we don't do well to try and claim this as a Christian country. We have some Christian roots, but I think it's unhelpful and largely inaccurate to say that we were a Christian country.
I think what was the percentage of people claiming Christian at the last census?
Well, it's about 66% or something.
Yeah.
I don't think
maybe they are, but we should not be ashamed of that figure, because atheists will tell us, we're post-Christian. Sorry, 66% at the last.
In the 60s,
nominate themselves as being Christian.
We're losing ground every census, of course. But no one makes them tick the box, and I think that we do shortchange people even if they just tick a box, because what they're really doing there is that they're saying that that's my ethos. Maybe I don't go to church, maybe I don't pray every day, but I do believe in God, and I celebrate Christmas, and I take on board things like the Golden Rule, and I take on board other Christian things.
There's two different kinds of Christian here, and I'm one of them, and you're both of them. Christian for most of us means we follow Jesus. Christian for some people means something less than that, and you're actually advocating both kinds of Christianity.
That's a quite interesting.
I thought of Richard Pratt made me think of this.
Wow.
Who made you?
Well, a Christian is someone whom Christ claims. And it's very difficult for me to know who that is. If someone ticks a box, Christian, what that means for them, I can't tell from the census form. I can know they don't go to church because I can watch them. But what goes on in their heart is a very mysterious thing.
But we, as committed Christians, are trying to, we're presenting things, points of view that come from the Christian worldview, but we're also kind of using this nominal Christianity as that is part of Australia, as trying to back that up, even though it's a different kind of Christian. I'm not explaining
but
that.
we are glad that if I drop my credit card in the shop, I'm glad that the non-church going person next to me that might tick the box will pick that up. I mean, maybe an atheist would as well. Maybe he would, I don't know. But in other parts of the world, they would pounce on that and run out of the shop and hope that I didn't notice.
Yes.
And we're losing that in Australia, granted, but it was there much more powerfully in a previous era. And I think that while even 100 years ago, when everyone was in church, we still had the problem that, well, which one of them is claimed by Christ?
I don't think everyone wasn't in church then. If you go back to the start of Australia, the early days of New South Wales, most children were born illegitimately, and prostitution was rampant, and
Yeah, but that was only in the eastern states.
And you go to look at the early missionaries to Aboriginal communities, and the mainstream white Australians were fighting against the missionaries. The missionaries were trying to look after the Aboriginal people, and the mainstream white Australians were fighting against God's representatives there. And you read things like that, and you say, Australia wasn't a Christian country. There have always been some Christians and some non-Christians. There is a lot of Christian values that we've definitely inherited, but to say we're a Christian country is not entirely accurate, and it
was officially.
But when you...
But there were rebels in that society.
I don't think I use the phrase, in fact, but my point is that I use the term Christian foundation.
We have some Christian foundation.
Well, I think we have a very strong one, and we still have the Lord's Prayer every day in Parliament.
We do, and that's, I suppose that's another thing that some Christians are advocating. We should keep that. That's kind of a symbol of Christians being in charge, and
the Christian flag.
Yeah.
The Parliament every day chooses to begin each day with Christian prayer.
This comes to the other, like, on one level we're talking a debate that's been going around for 400 years, because you've got on
not in Australia.
Not in Australia, but like in Europe certainly, you've got the debate between what we'll call magisterial Protestants or magisterial Christians. So those that see that church and government need to be intrinsically tied, and we might put Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, Cranmer, a whole host of different things in there. But then we've also got Mennonites and Anabaptists and people like that, and they've always argued that as soon as you're in bed with government, you're doomed. And that instead what you need to do is, if you want to create the kingdom, if you want to create justice and those kind of things, you do that within Christian community, because and the idea of that is that you go out and do mission, but you do that at the grassroots level, instead of going... So whereas magisterials try to do things from the top, Mennonites and people like that do it from the bottom, and they try to bring people into the Christian community, which is meant to represent the kingdom, rather than the top-down model of, say, the Lutherans or something like that, where you're trying to influence government to permeate Christian values.
Which one's right?
Well,
you see both in the Bible, don't you?
Yeah.
They're going at it from all sides.
Yeah, I'm not going to presume to have an answer to that. I think there's problems with both. I think Mennonites, for example, are very averse to getting involved in government until they need to call the cops, and then really would like.
Well, we're all
someone who-
like that, aren't we?
Yeah, you know, so I'm not really going to advocate one way or the other, but I am interested that, I mean, you're very much taking that magisterial model.
And he goes to a Baptist church.
Yeah, well, Baptists have sometimes fallen away.
Well, I'm not sure that I am entirely. I'm keen for Christians to penetrate throughout the entire culture and to commend wisdom throughout the entire culture. Not, as I've indicated, to force people to convert or to behave in a certain way because we believe that's the Christian way and therefore you should do as you're told, but that we would persuade each other in the community that this is the right way of doing things. If it is, well, it will accord with the Christian worldview if it is good.
But if you're advocating things like the Lord's Prayer and stuff like that, I mean, the Mennonites would flat out hate that. And the reason they would hate, and I know that because I used to study with Mennonites, and the reason they don't like things like that, particularly in the Canadian system, is that they feel that that is not its sincere.
No, but they wouldn't be in the Parliament to have to wrestle with the question.
Exactly. But they
but those who are in the Parliament choose every day to do it. They could stop it tomorrow, but they want to do it.
I think it's a good thing. I mean, it, you know, it does at least, it reminds them, you know.
I get a Bible study where they would say a lot of this is idolatry. That anything that man has made, like religions, like Anglican that I go on to, Henry VIII is our saint. And that's a human institution. And all the churches are the same. They're all idolatrous because they were started by human beings and they're trying with human beings to do something for God. They're trying to get themselves saved by God. They're trying to win the world over for God. We even mentioned it here that we are trying to bring in the kingdom of heaven. But according to these people, and I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, all power and authority on earth has been given to Jesus. Yes. Not to the Queen, not to anyone else, but to Jesus. And he has already done it.
Well, the authorities that exist have been established by God, is what Paul says in Romans 13.
We're not talking about that. He's already done it and he's already established it.
Well, that's because of
and
him, though.
All we have to do is to go in and recognise it. And all this business with politics and human institutions
But Christ claims all of the institutions.
Is idolatry.
But Christ claims all the thrones, powers, rules,
They've
and authorities.
been made by the powers and thrones.
They've been made by Christ.
The powers and thrones were evil spirits. And
visible.
Satan.
Just a sec. Phil, what are you suggesting that we ought to do?
Well, I'm not suggesting. I'm learning this myself, but something to it. But what they say is that our King is Christ and nobody else, and we do what He asks us to do, which was to follow Him. He doesn't need Christians to do anything. He's asked you to follow Him. He's already done it. He now says, go in and let the people know what has happened and make disciples of the nations, but not political.
You reckon we should keep out of politics?
Well, we've got to try. Israel became political Israel, and that was condemned as idolatrous. It was a remnant.
The problem is if Christians abdicate their role as salt and light in the community, they'll create a vacuum which will be filled by people who don't hold Christian principles, and they will destroy our nation.
Was William Wilberforce wrong as a parliamentarian to be parliament?
It doesn't matter who the person was, and whether we're the salt of the earth. If that's the case, Jesus certainly says that. And we think, well, if we don't do this and we don't get involved, the whole thing's going to collapse, and that's idolatry, because God has already controlled the earth. It's running His way. The point was made when remember when Jesus went over the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and he found a demoniac there, and amongst the tombs, and he was out of his mind. And he came to Jesus, and Jesus took the evil spirits that were in him and put them in the pigs, and they ran down to the ocean. The villagers came out, and they said, "What are you doing? These are our pigs. This is our business, And they begged Jesus to go away from them. And Jesus said he would, and he would not come back. what this is saying is that there was judgment on that day. Every time that Jesus speaks, and this is particularly in Mark, instantly, straight after, there is judgment. And when the king comes, people reveal themselves as belonging to their God's people or they're not. The demoniac was sitting in his right mind, which means that as Jesus came, he now became a true human being. He wanted to follow Jesus, and he said, no, don't. Go and tell your brothers and sisters what's been done for you. That's the kingdom of God going. The villagers came out, and they wanted to get rid of him, and that's the kingdom of God coming as well, in judgment.
Well, he destroyed their beloved pigs.
Yeah, but in judgment, that was their value. All they cared about their beloved pigs.
Yeah.
Not who this man is.
Yes,
and that's what would happen today. Well, that's at least the thing. In the wars we've seen today is God's judgment.
This is true.
Yeah, but there's like one attitude that Christians can have towards the environmental movement is that this world's going to pass away. It's all going to be destroyed by fire. So who gives a damn? But that seems like a dangerous view to hold.
I think so. I want to hand the world over in good working order.
Yeah.
And the community.
So this hands-off approach seems to have...
Yeah.
The idea would be not to join in, well, not necessarily, this is mine too, with human governments, but that Christians individually recognise that
what you're
God's
saying
will.
is true, that if we rely upon our own abilities, whether they be political or the spade used to dig the potatoes out of the ground, if we're relying upon material things in our own effort, that is indeed idolatry. But the process of farming is not idolatrous when it's offered to God. So the farmer ought to pray as he digs his potatoes, and the politician ought to pray as he passes laws for the benefit of the community.
The Christians go out to preach the gospel.
Yeah.
That's what they do. And they can make use of tractors and anything else.
Yes. All of that,
Yeah,
including
all of that.
including
But
political,
their purpose
including
as a
government.
group is preaching the gospel.
Yeah. I think we better wind up now, and we can continue the conversation after the meeting's formally closed. But thank you very much for coming to speak to us and facing. I was not really very hostile.
No, we're all on the same page,
but all
enjoyed
questioning
the
it.
cut and thrust.